Make the bloody vaccines available to those who want them. Quit using force to ensure compliance on the part of those who don't. Some of the latter might be crazy, but by and large, they're no crazier than the rest of us. Set a date. Open the damn country back up before we wreck something we can't fix.
That was Jordan Peterson reflecting on his article for the National Post, a Canadian newspaper, that he published in January 2022. It's pretty gripping stuff. And what I want to do today is explore the video that he released. That was just pretty much a video representation of that article. And I want to dissect it a little bit and relate it to my reflections back in 2020, where I'd written an article and compared what was actually going on here in Melbourne, Australia, with the lockdowns, and my father's experience during communist Romania, and what I tended to see happening around me at that time. For whatever it's worth, I'll give you my tidbits and my commentary on Jordan Peterson's reflections, and we can go from there.
I spent more than 3 hours on the phone last weekend trying to get through to the online security department of one of Canada's major banks. One of my accounts was shut down because I had the effrontery to sign in from Alberta, an event too unexpected for the bank's security systems. I was placed on hold interminably, subjected all the while to the corporate world's idea of music to soothe me. I was then offered a call back, which I duly received 45 minutes later. Then I was placed on hold again and again and again. This all occurred after my patience had already been exhausted in the aftermath of trying to fly in Canada.
So here he is discussing his experiences with the lockdowns and just trying to get someone on the phone, which we all know how annoying it is getting people on the phone, especially in these days. From a therapeutic point of view, I've spent hours trying to get in contact with people like child protection, for example, if we needed to have a bit of a discussion around that and reflect on children's well-being, which you could kind of think that was pretty important. So many different organizations that are supposed to be there to help have excruciating waiting lists, and it makes it really difficult for the people who are doing their hardest to try to support people who are going through the toughest of the tough. And accessing therapy during these times is a very difficult thing. Now, Jordan Peterson isn't reflecting on a therapeutic element of it. In fact, he hasn't seen a client for some time now, but he is reflecting on these business residues of these lockdowns and what's actually going on here. Let's continue.
Lockdowns, restrictions, limits on personal and social gatherings, precautions. There are empty shelves in the grocery stores here in Fairview. The supply chains that provide our food just in time are severely stressed. While I was here, I spoke with a local restaurateur who operates the pizza place I worked in 40 years ago. She is barely hanging on. This is true of most local businesses.
Never before have I seen so many for lease signs when walking through the Melbourne CBD. Never before have I seen so many people trying to rush the stores for meat and toilet paper, pushing other people over and snatching things from another person's hands who has these items. It's truly difficult to watch, and as we can see, this isn't something that's just happening here in Australia. It's happening around the world, and from a very human point of view, we can really understand that we have a perceived threat that we act on, and when there's a scarcity of resources, we're willing to get our fangs out, to dig into the people that are going to present even more of a scarcity. And that's what we've been seeing a lot these days, though not to the extent of people punching on. I haven't seen that personally, but it does happen, as we can see in videos.
It was the empty shelves in the grocery store in northern Alberta. It was the daughter of the man I once worked for as a cook back when I was a teenager. It was the shopkeepers and small business people I have spoken with on this trip. We are pushing the complex systems upon which we depend and which are miraculously effective and efficient in their often thankless operation to the breaking point. Can you think of anything more unlikely than the fact that we can get instant, trouble-free access to our money online using systems that are virtually graft and corruption-free? Just imagine how much work, trust, and efficiency was and is necessary to make that a reality. Can you think of anything more unlikely than fast, reliable, and inexpensive jet air travel, nationally and internationally, in absolute safety? Or the constant provision of almost every consumer good imaginable in the midst of plentiful, varied, and inexpensive food? These systems are now shaking. We're compromising them seriously with this unending and unpredictable stream of restrictions, lockdowns, regulations, and curfews. We're also undermining our entire monetary system with the provision of unending largesse from government coffers to ease the stress of COVID response. We're playing with fire. We've demolished 2 Christmas seasons in a row. Life is short. These are rare occasions. We're stopping kids from attending school. We're sowing mistrust in our institutions in a seriously dangerous manner. We're frightening people to make them comply. We're producing bureaucratic institutions that hypothetically hold public health in the highest regard, but subordinating all our properly political institutions to that end. Because we lack leadership and rely on ultimately unreliable opinion polls to govern broad-scale policy at the political level. I've never seen breakdown in institutional trust on this scale before in my lifetime. I was recently in Nashville, Tennessee. No lockdowns, no masks, no COVID regulations to speak of. People are going about their lives.
Now, this is a really interesting point. I'm not sure how many of you have been able to travel during this time, but going from a place where there is effectively infinite amount of lockdowns, restrictions, curfews, as was so in Melbourne, the most locked down city in the world, to a place, say, up in Queensland, where there were almost no restrictions, being able to go through the shopping centres and not have to wear a mask and be free, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, to enjoy life as you see fit. It was a truly emotional experience for many of us, and myself having to experience that. It's a very interesting experience, and then you go back to your own state and it's like, what the hell is going on here? It makes it horrible. It brings out the contrast and lends towards hopelessness in certain areas of time, depending on what your mood is and what you're predisposed to.
Why can that be the case in Tennessee and in other U.S. states such as Florida when there are curfews in Quebec 2 years after the pandemic started, with a vaccination rate of nearly 80%? When BC is still limiting social gatherings, when we are putting tremendous and unsustainable strain on all the complex systems that have served us so well and made us so comfortable in the midst of the troubles of our lives. The cure has become worse than the disease.
I want to comment on this a little bit, because I read about this back in 2020 on a LinkedIn article, and I want to read a few snippets of that. The Victorian Lockdown, a therapist's opinion, published on September 4, 2020. He spotted the man as tall as he remembered him filling up at a petrol station in a rural Romanian town. He frowned and made his way to this man, his heart beating. "Do you remember me?" he asked. The other man looked as he was approached and put the petrol pump back where it belonged and assessed the situation. After a little while, he replied, "You look familiar, I just can't place you." The man tells him his name, and instantly there's a recognition. One day I took my eyes off you, and you were gone. Yes, yeah, I remember you." The man who approached the person at the petrol station was my father. He was trailed by this very member of the secret police a decade earlier because he was considered a flight risk. You see, my father left the communist country of Romania in the late 80s, fleeing across the border into Serbia, and then crossing through a mountain tunnel to Austria, where he spent months in a detention camp. His crime? He wanted to join his pregnant wife, who had recently been given tickets out of the country to Australia. The problem was he was not provided with the same luxury. The story goes beyond what I can tell in a brief article, but needless to say, my father did it tough and made his mark in a country that he told me time and again as I grew up was the best country, the best city in the world. Of course it was. It was chalk to cheese when you compare it to where he came from. A place that painted the streets outside Parliament with the blood of its citizens. A place where you were constantly being monitored and punished if you represented views different to the ruling party, kind of like what we're seeing these days. Like something out of an Orwellian novel. A place where you were shot and killed if you attempted to cross the borders. Eaten by soldiers' dogs if you weren't lucky. In fact, this happened. That will never happen in Australia. Fast forward to 2020, I hear my father lament that what he experienced back in the communist government of Romania was beginning to feel a whole lot like what was currently happening in Victoria. This was coming from the same man who lauded the decision he made all those years ago where he felt hopeless, despondent, traumatized. I'm a therapist. I try to help others, and I, perhaps naively, never thought I would see myself in a state where pregnant mothers were being arrested over Facebook posts, where the population of a state is kept under lock and key for 23 hours a day, where my children are crying because they can't climb park equipment because it's now unlawful. I live in a state where schools are closed, where the elderly are dying alone, where hundreds of thousands are losing their jobs, where predators are targeting kids at a tenfold increase online. Yes, this is happening. As a therapist, I see my clients hurting. They are missing out on attending funerals of loved ones, not being able to socialize. They find themselves with increasing mental distress, suicidality, arguments, family violence, and the list goes on. I've seen this with my own eyes. I've heard it with my own ears, and nothing changes. I fear that this particular virus, insidious as it doubtless is for some, is pitifully overshadowed by the harms that the current aims to combat are revealing to us. Is a medicine more harmful than the disease? And so I write, and I wonder, why is there a total focus on the numbers of this virus, the only metric focused on in the daily briefings that our media are portraying? Why is there not a focus on the amount of lost learning, on the increased predatory behavior towards our children online? Why not attention to the addictions our kids are developing to various forms of technology, the lack of exercise, the increased family violence, the lost jobs, the spousal and familial arguments that will inevitably fracture relationships, the lost visitation rights, the inability to visit newborn children, the disregard to those imprisoned where social distancing and face coverings are not important, the lack of support to first-time mothers who are not being shown the ropes at hospitals, the stress on our healthcare system workers, the stories of teachers who are struggling because they're not seeing the massive influx of learning that usually happens in term 3, for example. The struggles of working parents who are also expected to school their children. And why are the Victorian people being blamed amidst all this? It's tough, and the list inevitably goes on. I feel sick to my stomach as I write this. I feel angry, furious, saddened, ashamed, guilty, hopeful, happy. So many emotions run through me, and yet nothing seems to change around us. And although I stop, I could write more. I'll ask you to consider these points and not only focus on daily numbers, but making changes that a host of medical professionals have advised and have not been considered. Consider this, and please wake up from your slumber. 2020, this was written on September 4th, 2020, and I'm sad to say that January 2022, little has changed.
I have recently spoken with senior advisors to provincial governments in Canada. There is no endgame in sight. The idea that Canadian policy is or should be governed by the science is not only not true, it's also not possible, as there is no simple pathway from the facts of science to the complexities of policy. We are deciding by opinion poll to live in fear and to become increasingly authoritarian in response to that fear. That's a danger too. And it's increasingly real. How long are we going to flail about, hiding behind our masks, afraid to send our children, who are in no danger more serious than risk of the flu, to school, charging university students full tuition for 10th-rate online education, pitting family member against family member over vaccine policy, and, most seriously, compromising the great economic engine upon which our health also depends, until we decide not to. There are no risk-free paths forward. There's only one risk or another. Pick your poison. That's the choice life offers. I am weary of living under the increasingly authoritarian dictates of a polity hyper-concerned with one risk and oblivious to all others. And things are shaking around us. Enough, Canadians. Enough, Canadian politicos. Enough masks. Enough social gathering limitations. Enough restaurant closures. Enough undermining of political and social trust. Make the bloody vaccines available to those who want them. Quit using force to ensure compliance on the part of those who don't. Some of the latter might be crazy, but by and large, they're no crazier than the rest of us. Set a date. Open the damn country back up before we wreck something we can't fix.